Again, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to have all of you on, and I know we have people from around the world who've already joined. We're also very pleased to have 4 experts with us today who will be introducing shortly. Again, a reminder to please go on mute if you're not speaking, and if you're on a telephone line like I am, you can also unmute with the *6 command. And again, please introduce yourself through the chat function and feel free to use that liberally as we go through the webinar. We're going to cover first just some TCLP business, just give people a reminder of some of the work that we're doing and a heads up on some things that are coming up. And then introduce our speakers and hear from them on this very timely topic of urban resilience in the time of COVID-19 and climate change. And, you know, there are other things happening on top of those, as we're all aware, including here in the United States and in other parts of the world. So we're pleased to have a relatively informal and timely, salient topic for today's webinar. Our TCLP business this year really is about a global learning collaboration with many of you and others who've opted to use this platform for this type of sharing and learning. We're continuing to have monthly webinars like this one today, and we will continue to have these about every 1 to 2 months for the entire TCLP. We will also be having the 4 interest groups start very soon. In fact, we've launched the CMM, the Transformational Change Concepts, Methods and Metrics interest group, and that first kickoff call will be on June 18th. We also have interest groups covering resilience and landscapes, forest and agriculture. And energy. So they're 4 altogether, covering, again, resilience, landscapes, energy, and concepts, methods, and metrics. Many of you have expressed interest in at least one of these groups, and for those who have already expressed interest, we will be reaching out to those of you who haven't heard about the group that you're interested in. We're sending draft charters for each of the group, an initial roster of participants, and a scheduling email to try to poll when the people interested in each group are available so that we can get those scheduled. Pretty happy about that. We also have ongoing work with case studies and a resource repository around transformational change information, data, and resources. We're very happy that the Zambia resilience case study was finalized recently, and I think we sent it with the very last communication we had prior to this webinar. We're working on 3 other case studies at the moment. Next one up will probably be around forest work in Mexico and the long-term transformational change story in that country and sector. We do want to invite others to share their stories with us, whether they are formal written materials or studies or just informal notes you may have or even websites. When something resonates with all of you as being transformative in a positive way, we do want to share that story and learn more from it. It does not have to necessarily use the dimensions framework that we use for transformational change so far, but if it does, of course, that would be a bonus. I'm going to just leave it at that for the overarching TCLP business, but I am very pleased to welcome the new TCLP facilitation team to our work, and we have team members on today. I am happy to be working with this group of experts who not only are here to help facilitate, but bring content expertise and experience with this work to the table and to the TCLP dialogue. Ross Strategic, led by Tim Larson, who's on and who will be introducing himself and others in a moment, has been involved in the TCLP work since 2017, helped to create the frameworks, including the dimensions, arenas of intervention, and others. Helped to do a portfolio analysis of the CIF portfolio of programs and projects, and was on both the the facilitated learning team and the evaluation team in 2018 and 2019. There are colleagues on the line and on the team from C230, based in Mexico City, which has experience with the TCLP itself and with developing a guidance on transformational change oriented toward the multilateral development banks and designing programs and projects for transformation. And Nasiba Jamor, who is on the line, some of you may know from the Climate Investment Fund's trust fund committees. She was the focal point for Mexico for CIF, for the Forest Investment Program for many years, and has held positions not only on governance committees, but with the advisory group for the Evaluation and Learning Initiative, and has herself participated in the TCLP. It's a great team. I'm going to just pass over to Tim Larson to do a few more brief introductions, so you'll be able to recognize them as you hear from them throughout the year. Tim?
Great, thank you, Anna. Our team is really thrilled to be working with the TCLP again, and really over the next several months, working with you all to further advance thinking around concepts and relevance of transformational change in each of these different interest groups that you'll hear more about in a few minutes. I'll be serving as a lead facilitator for the Transformational Change Concepts, Methods, and Metrics interest group. Nasibe, who's been introduced, who many of you I'm sure know, will be lead facilitator for the Landscapes group that you'll hear more about. My colleague at Ross Strategic, Nandini Chattervedula, will be serving as lead facilitator for the energy-focused interest group. And Carolina Agurto at C230 will be serving as our lead facilitator for the climate resilience and adaptation interest group. So in addition to those key people, another name you may be hearing a lot of, and she's on the line as well, is Shelby Thomas. She'll be working to kind of coordinate across all of our work and support our scheduling and technical support team. And we've got a few other folks on the team to just support the groups and the TCLP as it moves forward with note-taking and synthesis development and scheduling. So we're really thrilled to be working with you all to make this a smooth process, and look forward to having more time to talk with each of you. And at this point, I think I'll just turn it back to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim. Let me double check if anybody else would like to share any other TCLP updates or business. I think we covered the bases. We are excited to be working within the Evaluation and Learning Initiative of the Climate Investment Funds, and in collaboration with many other efforts that are happening not only within the initiative, such as the just transition work that the initiative and CIF on the whole are undertaking, and many related efforts that we integrate into this work. We will continue to integrate not only work happening within the CIF community, but work happening with many of you, and things that are related to transformational change at this moment in time that may not have to do with climate finance per se, but certainly fit within the broader scope of what we're all trying to improve upon and achieve. With that, we're going to pass it over to the urban resilience speakers, and I'm going to introduce them briefly, but then have them one by one go through their thoughts on this issue in a relatively short period of time, but I'll have Tim tee that up more properly in a moment. Katerina Sarfati is with C4 Cities Inclusive Climate Action Program, and is the director or head, and she will be speaking first. I know that she's working right now with mayors of major cities around the world and others, and she has some urgent work to do. So we do want to give her the opportunity to speak, and then she has to go and take care of some urgent business. Carlos Martin is a senior fellow of the Metropolitan Housing and Community Policy Center at the Urban Institute. And he will be sharing some insights from his work over several years and currently reflecting on those programs and work he's done also with 100 resilient cities. Laura Valiente de Macedo, I'm sorry, Laura, if I'm mispronouncing your last name, is going to be speaking with us from her multiple hats that she has worn, including with the World Resources Institute, the World Business Council and Sustainable Development. She's worked also with cities and the state of Sao Paulo and many others. We're happy to have Laura today. And Robert Muga is also on the line, independent specialist and expert with many sectors and experiences under his hat, and specializing in city security, migration, and new technologies. Thank you to all four of you for being here today and being willing to share some of your thoughts and work with us. We look forward to hearing from you. And with that, I'll pass it over to Tim. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Anna. So we're going to kick off, as was mentioned, with Carolina and take about 8 to 10 minutes for Katerina to share some thoughts. And then given that she does have to leave shortly after that, we'll pause and take some clarifying questions or questions that you all have based on her reflections. So Katerina, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim, and everybody for the invitation. Very happy to be here with you today. I do have a couple of slides. Shall I share directly my screen?
Yes, you're welcome to share that way, or we can.
Okay. I'm not sure. There doesn't seem to be the.
You see the little icon with the box with the up arrow?
Yeah. I definitely do, but there doesn't seem to be the possibility to share the PDF, but just the entire screen. Sorry, the presentation of the PDF.
Regan, could you please pull up the slides and you can share them?
Yeah, maybe that's the best way of doing it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. See, they just.
So while maybe
finished.
We'll do this just as a matter of introduction. I'm Caterina Sarfatti. I'm based in Italy, and I've been working for C40 for the past 4 years and a half, developing and heading our Inclusive Climate Action Program, which is a program that supports cities and mayors in ensuring that their climate policies and climate activities are also equitable, just, and socially desirable. Part of my work has been repurposed recently to lead on our new C40's mayoral task force on recovery, from which I would like to share some thoughts with you today. Next slide, please. Thank you very much for pulling them up. So as you can imagine, the mayors have been, for those who don't know, we are a network of 96 of the largest cities in the world, and a network of mayors, first and foremost, that are committed in first person to tackle the climate crisis and work around climate change. As you can imagine, the mayors have immediately diverted their priority attention and work on tackling the health crisis and defeating the COVID-19 virus. Nothing has been more important for them than saving lives, and their priorities and work has been immediately addressed to tackling the crisis. And what we have seen on one hand is an immediate response from mayors, but also a massive impact, as you can imagine, on our cities and on, most importantly, some major sort of commitments and activities that around climate and environment. For example, dense areas meant increased risk. There has been a reduction in public transport and therefore a strain in the public transport system of many of our cities. Financial priorities have shifted, and so funding that was, for example, dedicated to flood prevention or protection mechanisms or resilience and adaptation had been diverted to manage the COVID-19 response, for example, in many African cities. And waste is another example, including segregated collection, has been cut or undermined by the crisis. So rollback and potentially massive challenge around climate, environmental, but also social policies and programs in our cities. But as this slide shows, we have seen that the crisis has underlined also the ability of mayors to collaboratively work together. We have seen it in our platform at C40 Cities. Rather than reiterating into isolation, C40 mayors have instinctively reached out to each other and helped each other immediately. We have been hosting webinars with mayors from around the world, 40, 50 mayors present, really wanting to work together on the response and now also the recovery of after COVID. Next slide, please. So we're seeing that our mayors are taking the lead to formulate what our recovery would look like, and not surprisingly, but definitely not a given, the mayors have manifested the idea that the recovery, in order to be effective and in order for us not to face similar crises like this in the future, has to be green, has to be sustainable, and first and foremost has to be just. Investment in infrastructure and public services, including healthcare and other social programs, are vital for the long-term economic recovery. But even most importantly, C40 mayors agree that the recovery should not be a return to business as usual. In economic terms, our mayors, quoting one of our mayors, our big enemy is returning to the past. And therefore, understanding what a new normal looks like in our cities is key to ensure an equitable and more sustainable recovery. For this reason, next slide, please. Under the leadership of Mayor Sala, Mayor of Milan, and our chair, Mayor Garcetti, we have established this recovery task force with mayors from around the world that have been identified on the basis of geographical diversity, gender diversity, but most importantly, expertise in dealing with similar crises, and that are now working together with experts, social and economical experts, and internal experts in C40s to really define what a green and just recovery looks like in practice. What are the actions, what are the initiatives, what are the policies that cities can put in place effectively, and therefore also what are the asks to other levels of governments and other levels of institutions in order to implement these policies and these actions. Next slide, please. So some of the initial emerging themes that we are seeing from discussing with the mayors of the task force, but more broadly with the mayors of the organization. First of all, as I was mentioning before, defending mass transit as a key action to promote clean air, increase the health of residents, and also ensure equitable access to jobs and services. Mass transit has really been challenged by this crisis, and so defending it, investing it, and promoting it in order to be affordable, accessible, frequent, and safe is a key priority of cities. Another emerging theme is rethinking density and public space. Many cities are thinking about this new concept of the 15-minute city, so ensuring a polycentric city with neighborhoods that guarantee access to fundamental basic services within 15 minutes of or walking or cycling for everybody. And this is also a way that cities are developing in order to make fundamental public services resilient to crisis and accessible. And then, not surprisingly, job creation, access to job creation, and also training and upskilling to access jobs is a massive priority in this moment. And not surprisingly, specific climate actions and climate policies, like, for example, building retrofits and energy efficiency programs, seem to be a key priority and a key measure for recovery in order to make sure that homes are healthy, but also that jobs are created at a local level for local people. Next slide. And this is, I think, is my last slide, so hopefully I kept the time. Because of the massive crisis that we're in, like I personally don't like to speak about opportunity when there is a massive tragedy like the one from COVID-19. We should never speak about opportunities, but nevertheless, there is a potential game changement and game changer from the adversity that we're seeing in our cities. And this really derives from what our mayors are saying and putting in place in some of the biggest cities of the world. There is a chance to make sure that innovation is not incremental, but actually radical. This crisis has showed that mass behavior change is possible when life is at risk. And because of the COVID-19 crisis, the climate crisis has not disappeared magically. It's still there. But there may be a new understanding of the risk of pollution and the relationship between pollution and health impacts, which is even clearer now because of the spread of the virus. And therefore, there might be a better understanding from public opinion on the need to keep our air clean and our cities sustainable, healthy, and resilient. In many regions, we're seeing a surge in trust in the public sector, not in all regions, not in all cities, but there is a stronger level of trust in the government in some of the regions, and this can be used to produce change to tackle the health crisis and the climate crisis together. There is increased importance, as I was mentioning before, of the concept of resilience to crisis and the need for people to access fundamental services in the crisis. And therefore, it's not part of the bullet, but probably one of the most important things. There is a better understanding of the contribution of essential workers and the need to protect the rights and recognize essential workers and their contribution to society, and which relates to equity and social justice. And then there is potentially now, because of low interest rates and oil prices at a very, very low level, as one of the first time in the last 20, 30 years, there is a door open for massive sustainable investment at all levels of government. So I finish on a positive note. Of course, in this moment, change can go in every direction, but what we are seeing in some of our cities is very comforting in terms of political will and engagement in making sure that recovering from the crisis means also tackling the climate crisis, improving resilience of our cities, and of course protecting the health and lives of our residents and citizens. I'll stop there. Hopefully it wasn't too long, and please let me know if you have comments, questions, feedback, if you strongly disagree with anything that I've said, and also happy for you to reach out directly for further discussions at my email address that is here on the screen. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Katerina. Perfect timing, and you covered an amazing amount of ground in that short period. I did want to pause here to take some questions because I know that you'll need to leave us quite soon. So encourage people to chat in questions that you have. And I do see one that's come in related to one of the kind of key focal areas you mentioned in the presentation was about mass transit and really protecting its role and links to clean air. And so the question, though, is from Neil Bird about how can mass transit systems be planned to comply with social distancing measures in this current period? And is that a contradiction or a challenge, and a sense that in some places, including the UK, that there's advocacy for using private vehicles, as an alternative to transit. So just curious how you see, particularly in the context of the pandemic, mass transit system promotion fitting in that context.
Do you want to gather a couple of questions, or shall I respond one-to-one?
Why don't you start with that one? And actually, there's one other one I can put in that are we taking more decentralization at the local level? Looks like that's from Imelda Atare. Not quite sure what the context around that. Are we talking more? I think maybe that's focused on, given the work that you all are doing, is that really at the city level that does apply decentralization? So maybe if you have some reflections about how that fits into broader national strategies as well.
Thanks a lot. So yes, in relationship to mass transit, I think Neil captured it very well. As I was mentioning at the beginning of the presentation, there is a challenge that we see in our cities, and some of our cities have been very explicit about it. Some cities have announced that mass transit will need to operate at an inferior capacity because of sanitary reasons, or had to operate an inferior capacity because of safety reasons, which means also that revenues have decreased, and in the context where transportation systems and local agency were already with budget constraints, this decrease in revenues have put the overall system in a strained situation and in a challenging situation, which is why it is so key in this moment, from our perspective, that whatever recovery sort of fund and investment at all levels of government is also directed to protect and invest further in mass transit if we want to ensure that it continues to operate in an effective, frequent, and accessible way, because first and foremost, it's of course an issue related to environmental sustainability and air pollution, but it's also an issue related to equity, as mass transit in many of our cities is the way for people to have access to jobs and access to key services. And therefore, trying to avoid an increased car usage in our cities is on both grounds, from an equitable perspective and an environmental one. So I think yes, Neil captured well the point. Around decentralization, yes, what I was mentioning is that there's been since 20, 30 years there is this debate around density. And I'm not an urban planner by background. I'm a political theorist by background, so don't feel like I'm the expert here. But of course, having worked for cities for many years, I know that this has been like a never-ending debate around: is density good, is density bad, should we protect density? And of course, as the virus surged, this has become again like a debate on how to conceive cities. And from my personal perspective, this is not sort of a C40 official opinion, but from my personal perspective, I think density is not the issue. It's how you organize it. And of course, the solution is not, again, promoting massive urban sprawl, as this has an impact on environmental sustainability and equity grounds again. And so this idea that cities are promoting about the 15-minute city is not against sort of dense and compact cities, but it's a way of organizing it that is potentially more innovative, potentially more equitable, and potentially even more resilient. So some cities like Paris, Bogota, Montreal, others are trying to sort of develop their urban planning schemes and policies and plans according to this concept, and we will see what the future will tell us. But yes, so I'm not sure if I answered the question, but these are some initial thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much. There's two other questions that would come in, and if I can read those out if you've got a quick response, and then I think we'll move on to our next speakers.
Sure.
So one is around have mayors been speaking about revenue generation and potential tax base, especially from corporates, as well as the fear of out-migration to suburbs, and kind of what does that mean for overall tax base and longer-term financial position of cities. And then the other question relates to any reflections based on the discussions among the mayors about how we can further shape the narrative of synergies between recovery and transformation agendas, and kind of city leadership in this regard.
Thanks. So the question around revenue generation is very, very interesting. Of course, it depends on the different sort of institutional governance and political context of the cities, because not all of, actually probably the majority of our cities don't have direct powers on revenue generation besides taxes around waste management or other minor sort of resources, or taxes, for example, around the use of public space. But it's not frequent in cities. I know, for example, the US cities may be different, but it's not frequent in all of our cities to have direct competence on this. So, of course, it's a mix of activities between local capacity of generate revenue and also integration with national government policies and financial schemes. But besides like the different sort of institutional and governance context, of course, how to finance and how to fund major sort of infrastructural, social and environmental projects, but also key services, will be a major challenge and potentially opportunity for cities in the coming months, considering the strain on budgets that COVID has put on cities. Like a very, very small examples, as a way of recovery, cities are thinking about exempting restaurant, bars, people to pay the tax on the public space, so that streets and public space can be re-given to people, to nature, to cultural activities, which of course is very, very important from a social and economical perspective. But from a financial one, it brings more strain to the city. So how to balance this is of course something that the cities will need to work on, and in particular with national government and other levels of government. And last but not least, and then I will close here, it gives the last question from Daniel gives me the opportunity to say that we are working with the mayors to develop a midterm report of the mayoral task force that exactly tries to do what Daniel was referring to, meaning tries to define what is the vision of recovery from a transformational perspective, and tries to define what are the sort of the key actions that mayors can put in place for a just and green recovery. And we will be launching this in July. So I will be happy sort of to share it with you when we launch it, and as a knowledge project that hopefully will be of inspiration for the urban community. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to sort of pre-announce this.
Great. Katerina, thank you so much for joining us and taking time to share the work of C40 Cities in this important moment. What we're going to do now is shift over and to our next speaker, Carlos Martin from the Urban Institute. And I think for the next three speakers, we'll do the presentations and maybe some real brief clarifying questions, and then move into the discussion after that. The aim today is, to really keep this as an informal learning opportunity and discussion. So I don't think all of the speakers were expected or planning to have slides, but to at least share some brief remarks to catalyze discussion. So with that, just encourage folks to chat in any clarifying questions you have, and we'll raise those as appropriate. And if you have reflections or comments or questions for more discussion focus, we'll take those up following the speaker presentations or discussion. Great. So turning now to Carlos Martin from the Urban Institute.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. And let me start off with some clarifying points myself. So my name is actually Carlos Martin. But I am from the Urban Institute, and as you can imagine, much of the work that we do is about cities. Urban Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization. So I'll be talking a little bit about the research perspectives on urban resilience today. We're also based in Washington, D.C. We're founded in 1968 by President Johnson to study the war on poverty and our urban crises that were occurring in the late 1960s in the U.S. So being in D.C., I'm also speaking from a city that has been under military occupation for 4 days. As many of the colleagues on this call, on this webinar, who are also based here know that we've been seeing the helicopters out of our windows for quite some time now. So in resilience theory, we talk about shocks and stressors. So it's very important that the audience today, the global audience that we have right now, understand that the protests that are being, that we're bearing witness to here in the United States are not the shock. The police state is the shock, and entrenched racism and income inequality and exclusion are the stressors. So we're seeing similar phenomena playing out in my fellow panelists' locations in Milano, in Sao Paulo, in Rio de Janeiro. These are manifesting a little differently, but it's the same fundamental problem. So when we speak about transformation today, let's make sure that we keep focus. So it's critical to note that so many of these incidences are not just the current protests, but also the COVID conditions are playing out very differently in cities. So Anna had asked me to talk about what makes a city different and what makes urban resilience different. So let's start out with the obvious. So how a city is a geographically defined place. It's a concentration of individuals, of communities, of economies. And what makes cities most interesting, not just because of that density, is that it's an interwoven system of systems. City governments often have as many authorities and constituents as many subnational and in some cases national governments have. So cities, let me say another obvious point that we need to call out. Cities are where most people live on this planet currently. 55% of the world's population live in urban areas. And by 2050, we know that that's going to go up to about 68%. So it's important to think about what makes a city constitutionally different, qualitatively and quantitatively because of its size, to potential shocks and stressors. So how is urban resilience different? So because of the size of cities, they have greater exposure to shocks, simply not just because of the size and their density, but also the concentration of lives and livelihoods that occur there that also affect national economics. There are typically greater localized disparities in cities due to racism, class inequality, et cetera, that lead to these persistent stressors. And so that creates heightened vulnerabilities to all kinds of shocks, be they climate-related, be they health-related, as we're seeing, be they to civil unrest. So there are microcosms of so much that occur on this planet are occurring in cities. So let me talk a little bit about some urban resilience interventions and what sort of insights we can gain from that. So going back to the Asian Cities for Climate Change Resilience Network, I believe it was referred to ACERN, to the 100 Resilient Cities intervention. In full disclosure, Urban Institute is the global evaluator with colleagues like C230, Cerro 30 in Mexico, dealing specifically with the evaluation and monitoring of the 100 RC program, and that evaluation is ongoing. They're the offspring of 100 RC, the Global Resilient City Network, that co-sponsors webinars with the bank, the Resilient Cities Catalyst, and various UN, World Bank, and advocacy group organizations like ICLEI, USDN, et cetera, that are putting some really interesting thought into what urban resilience interventions mean, both from the shock perspective as well as the stressor perspective. So there are two approaches. So there are a lot of ways we can break out and categorize these interventions, but there are two approaches that I definitely want to make sure that are noted today. One is the concept of transformational change at the institutional level. Both grassroots organizations as well as people who work in city politics, city policy, and city planning know that city governments are a very unique animal. And for thinking about how to deal with all kinds of shocks and the underlying chronic stressors, the approach has been to think about changing how city governments function, how they plan, and how they operate across silos. So there's been a lot of discussion, certainly at University focus on this as their primary model of de-siloing city government so that they could actually yield better products and better projects in the end. The second approach is that project focus. Are there specific interventions, be they infrastructure development, social cohesion, social capital building, et cetera, that could provide at least one measurable outcome of some sort of resilience building effort, be they addressed to the stressor or a specific kind of shock like chronic flooding, sea level rise, increased heat, et cetera. So these two have in some cases been posed as tensions to each other. What the evaluation has found so far, and I encourage you to read the midterm report that I think is being linked to this webinar that was published a year ago, thank you very much, there they are. The first one is that link to that midterm report that showed that there was some preliminary evidence right now that actually de-siloing institutionally, the way cities plan, the way cities operate, actually leads to better projects, mainly because you have a variety of different stakeholders, both within city government and in private and civil sector, having a say early on in what the benefits and what the cost of the specific projects would be. So again, the evaluation is ongoing, and we expect a final report in 2022, and we'll see how long those outcomes persist or how durable they are. So those are the kinds of interventions that are occurring right now. There are a variety of new efforts that many of the multilaterals, including the World Bank's tremendous work from their disaster recovery group and the American Resilient Cities functions have been pursuing. And there's a lot of interesting work going on the climate finance side. Certainly this group is probably most aware of that, but the other colleagues from the Global Commission on Adaptation, WRI, have been focusing on what makes a city a unique animal and what kind of financing structures, including everything from municipal bonding to public-private partnerships that can have leverage on that. So I think this tension between institutional change and specific projects, regardless of which approach an intervention takes, there are certain key questions that come out for me that I want to make sure that are planted in your heads as homework for all of you as we move forward. So we're talking about transformational projects. We're talking about transformation of institutions, but we have to ask the questions. These are transformations for whom? Do either of these approaches think about equity, not just in terms of equal access and proportional improvements, but equitably dealing with long-term disparities in exposure and how do they address the most vulnerable in our cities, and how, quite frankly, they address the poorest of our brothers and sisters. So there are lessons from the broader development world in terms of institutional change and how we can think about resilience interventions that deal with this. I definitely want to call out groups like the Climate Justice Resilience Fund, who has spoken on this webinar series before, who've looked at not just how the most vulnerable in our cities are benefited by these projects, but how they actually can create and develop their solutions on their own, and how those need to be funded, need to be paid attention to, and need to become central in our global perception of interventions in the resilience in the city urban resilience space. Second question I want to leave you with, it's a transformation from what shock. So the rhetorical concept of resilience and the practical concept, I should say, haven't always aligned. Certainly there have been thoughts about resilience to every potential shock, resilience dealing with every potential stressor, but the reality is that as finance knows, as city operations go, there do have to be specific kinds of projects that have the results. Fortunately, many of these projects, and again, dealing with the institutional change that leads to co-benefits across a variety of different topical areas like flood, like sea level, like heat, as well as specific vulnerable populations, these do exist. But there is this sort of tension about what is the actual shock that is being addressed. Is it a climate change specific? Is it any kind of condition? Or is it just dealing with underlying chronic stressors? So transformation for whom and transformation from what shock I think are important issues to think about. Certainly the COVID pandemic that we're all experiencing, and that is most acute in cities, sort of laid this out well. So much of the resilience intervention at the city level in the past 10 years has dealt primarily with the climate change effects, the long-term climate change effects, as well as specific hazard management. And health, public health, wasn't always at the foreground. If you read, for example, many of the resilience strategies that came out of the 100RC platform, public health interventions were very few and far between, and integrating that silo within the broader resilience conversation wasn't as robust as it was in these other areas, primarily because of that a topical focus. So it's something we want to think about in the longer term, which silos are included and which are not, because of how we're defining the shock, the relevant shock. All right, I think that pretty much wraps up any questions, any conversation that I had. I know that there are probably a lot of questions there, so I will let Tim navigate that.
Right, thanks so much, Carlos. Let's see, don't see many clarifying questions coming in, so please chat in if you have any, and in the absence of any coming in quite yet, I'm inclined to move to our next speaker, and we can take it up in any questions you all have in the discussion section. I would just note that one of the things that Joe Dickman chatted in was about the finding of benefits of early broad involvement in planning matches well with the findings from the CIF local stakeholder engagement evaluation. So definitely evidence from the CIF that I think supports those thoughts as well. Okay, with that, I'd like to turn to Laura Macedo, our next speaker. So Laura, you ready to share your reflections?
Good morning, everybody. I would like to thank Anna and her team for inviting me to join you today, and congratulate you on this initiative, which is very interesting, I think, and very opportune. I have been a practitioner in cities and governance for a while, and right now I'm engaged in academia. I have been with ICLEI for 8.5 years since 2012 in Latin America as a director, which is, I think, my strongest credential in terms of working with cities. I'm an architect by training, which is probably what sparked my interest in
Laura, I'm sorry to interrupt. This is Anna. But if you could speak up, I don't know if others are having a hard time hearing you, but I don't know if you could possibly get closer to the phone, or hopefully others can hear you. But I'm
okay.
Oh, better. That's good. Yes, thank you.
Is this better? Yeah, I had
yes,
it on,
yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. Go ahead.
Okay. So, did everybody hear me? Should I start again, you think?
You could hear okay, I think.
Okay.
I think you can go ahead.
Okay. So right now I'm a postdoctoral fellow and researcher in an international project led by Professor Pupim de Oliveira in the Public Administration Department of Fundação Getúlio Vargas. We're investigating the use of innovative green and blue infrastructure in cities and its impact on the nexus, which speaks to what Carlos mentioned earlier on silos thinking. So this is one of a strategy to actually overcome the silos mentality in urban management and to accelerate the trend towards collaborative governance. For those who are not familiar with the concept, it's an alternative approach for more sustainable use of resources. And the goal of this nexus approach is to mitigate the duration, intensity, and frequency of trade-offs. Urban areas have many challenges, like we have seen from our earlier speakers, that could be addressed under this perspective, such as waste management, wastewater management. They're all amenable to the trade-off analysis because of public health water supply, and ecosystem benefits. So we aim to help cities and practitioners to understand and govern these trade-offs. I have been personally in this project involved in identifying green and blue infrastructure in the global south and how they can be used as low-impact measures to address adaptation and resilience in developing countries. One of my findings is that there is much room for growth in this field because nature-based solutions, of which GBI is an option, is largely underestimated as a low-cost viable alternative to address adaptation and vulnerability to climate impact. So this is my voice on a nutshell, basically, and I was very happy to hear from Caterina about the efforts that mayors are making. I'm away from the Transformational Municipal Networks community for a while, now that I'm engaged in research and academia. But,
all right, fading a little bit. If you could step even a little bit closer to the microphone, that'd be great.
Whoa. Okay, is this better?
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry. Okay, so we're living in an urban planet. We're calling it now the Anthropocene and the urban age, actually, because as Carlos mentioned, we're more than half of the population living in cities, and this is a trend that probably will not go away. So cities have been spaces of opportunity, but they have also been places very vulnerable to the fact that people are all together. And the one thing that I would really think is important to change, the transformational change about what we're talking, is that we should change our consumption pattern. This is, I think, the most important lesson from this crisis. I mean, we have gone through other crises, both health and economic, more recently economic, and this is probably not the last one. I think that especially in cities, we have to learn how to deal with the crisis. And being from a developing country and living in Brazil, which is a very unequal society, we have islands of excellence, like in the city of São Paulo, and at the same time, there are people living, from hand to mouth every day, and in very, very difficult situations throughout the country. You can even compare these people as people living in, the Middle Ages or even the Stone Age, perhaps, in terms of development and access to what cities can bring as benefits. So I think it's very difficult that we make these people step up to the level of development in the 21st century, really. And they obviously are the most vulnerable people. Now in Brazil, because we already have huge challenges regarding urban governance and urban management, as well as probably have been following this in the news at federal level as well, it is very difficult to respond to yet another crisis on top of everything that's going on. So transformational change in Brazil is being forced into us, but not really necessarily in a positive way. So the one thing which is what we have benefit from, and that has been widely used in terms of addressing sustainability issues, poverty alleviation, and income generation, health, is really a nature-based solution. This is an issue that I'm learning every day more, that it's a huge opportunity for us to improve our quality of life and also to address health issues like the COVID, because, improve air quality and a number of benefits that actually, oh dear, sorry. Okay, so yeah, I suggest people to turn on their volumes as well, to turn up the volumes, because I'm speaking with a microphone here, so and I'm almost at the top of the volume here. But anyway, I think that the message really is this. Unlike my colleague Katerina, who earlier said that it's not a good time to talk about opportunities, I can sympathize with that, but I think we really, as managers, have to think about the opportunities ahead of us. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lara. Let's see. I'm not seeing any clarifying questions come in, so why don't we go to our last speaker and then we'll move to discussion. Robert Mugat.
Look, thanks for the invitation. Hopefully the sound is okay here. I guess to start, let me just state the obvious, which is that we're all living in pretty extraordinary times with some incredible transformations happening, not just for climate, but let me just join with Carlos and others to solidarity with what's happening right now in the U.S. and around the world with the protesters, the leaders, the mayors who are calling for social justice and, of course, for a better, greener world. I mean, it's a constellation of grievances right now that we're seeing. The big picture right now is that we are facing a huge health crisis, which has killed over 380,000 people, infected more than 6 million people. We're about to face we already are, and we are about to face a tsunami of economic consequences. And we're also seeing now the first real burst of the security implications of all of this. So this is a totalizing challenge that we're facing. And what COVID is doing, and everyone said this, and you'll hear it over and over, is that it's accelerating a set of existing trends, not least the digitalization of our societies, which I'll talk about, which has huge effects, I think, for climate and transformation more generally, but also some big downsides. It's also accelerating things like inequality between and within nations. Trends that have actually been slowing in some parts of the world are now starting to accelerate again. So I've spent the last couple of months talking with presidents, with ministers, with heads of agencies, with mayors. And what I see across the board is that, of course, everyone's hoping for a vaccine, and there's some really promising developments, but really nobody knows what comes next. There is huge uncertainty about the virus, the nature of the virus, about its effects on our bodies, about its mutations, about future waves, never mind the second, talk about third, fourth, fifth waves. So I think the big point I want to leave, if there's one, is that we can expect a lot more of this, these rolling crises, these systemic risks, which will compound one another. COVID is just one of the crises. It's one of the pandemics we're facing. Just so everyone knows, there have been at least a dozen other epidemics that have been noted in the last couple of months alone. And I work very closely with the Communicable Disease Unit of WHO. There are 11 big risks that they face right now, including disease X, which is the unknown unknown. And so let's get ready, because this is a huge test for all of us. So I would call what we're living through right now the age of uncertainty, where agility, speed, nimbleness, thinking long-term, and forecasting, what you're doing here with the TCLP, is going to become more important than ever. Let me just describe who I am. I've got a couple of hats like everybody else in this call. I run a digital risk firm. We focus on digital economy. We work a lot with the bank, as well as big tech companies and cities. We're trying to help improve the digital resilience of cities, a concept that I want to leave with you. The second thing I do is I run a think tank I co-founded in Latin America and Africa, based out of Rio, where we develop tech-enabled solutions for mayors and governments, but also for civil society. I co-chair something called the Global Parliament of Mayors, which is a network of 100 plus minus mayors around the world who are basically a city rights movement. And I work a lot on city regeneration with mayors and with city councils, with futurists and urban planners and the rest. So that's me. I was asked to say a few things, really just blue sky thinking. And I didn't prepare a presentation, but I essentially just had three basic ideas that I thought might be useful, or not. I mean, I guess I'd start by simply saying COVID-19 is this big stress test. Every mayor I speak to talks about how every system that they have, in governance and services and mobility and work and critical infrastructure, they're all being tested simultaneously to varying degrees, depending on the city. And so I think what's exciting from a research perspective, I won't talk about opportunity, but I'm a social scientist, is that this is the biggest natural experiment that I can, and certainly in my lifetime, where basically every city, every government is going through a kind of test. So there's an enormous amount to be learned. And it's hard to keep track of all the different changes. So I would encourage a comprehensive view of the stresses that are happening. And I've written a lot about this lately in Foreign Policy and NPR and the rest. So happy to share some of my insights. But here's my first insight, which is that this is, and it was already alluded to by Carlos and others, a profoundly urban emergency. Many of our maps that we use, like the famous JHU, Johns Hopkins University map that everyone here knows about, frames the crisis, with the exception of China and the US, as a kind of national crisis. We talk of countries coming out of lockdown. We talk about how national leaders have been dealing or not with this crisis. And while that's valid, I think what's happening and much more profound to think about is how a lot of what we're seeing is happening at an urban or a suburban scale. And so I think we need to change our optics a bit, which is why I think this session is really useful. COVID began, we think it began in a city. Over 95% of the alleged infections or reported infections have taken place in cities. And we could say that there's big biases here in reporting. And it's precisely because we live in this interconnected, interdependent, globalized world that so many of our big global cities were affected. It's the properties of cities. I think all the panelists have talked about this. Their density, the predisposition towards overcrowding, the informality, which is a big issue, that have helped in some ways contagion spread. But I think, and here's the punchline, cities are going to be key to the response. So many of the answers to dealing with the challenges of emerging from lockdown and the transformations on the environment front are going to be happening with our mayors, with our planners, with our leaders, our civic leaders. And they're leading the charge right now. And that was, I think, abundantly apparent in all of the panelists. The mayors I talk to, they do talk about opportunity. And I think everyone's wary of Naomi Klein's, disaster capitalism thesis and the risks of, abusing this moment. But city leaders are talking about this opportunity to reimagine their cities in many cases, certainly first mover cities like Melbourne and Amsterdam and San Francisco and others. But I'm also seeing this in lower middle income cities as well. Some of them believe that this shock, and I agree with Carlos's interpretation of the shock, it's not so much the COVID as much as the response, could lead to the redesign and building of more resilient, sustainable, people-centered cities. So this is already in the heads. The problem, I think, for many mayors is they don't have the time with their city planners to really think through the long term because they're plugging so many holes, right? There's a crisis every second, and so they don't get that opportunity space. So there's an issue there that needs to be thought through. The pandemic is also, and this is really interesting, I think, speeding up the redistribution of power, or at least it's clarifying the distribution of power in ways that we maybe hadn't really understood so clearly before. Because COVID-19 has revealed the weaknesses of many national governments, and there are many, by the way, who stood out, and we all know who they are, it's also reinforcing the power and influence of some governors and mayors at the subnational level. And it's highlighting or hardening the legality or the normative component of that and how political power is distributed in the system. And so I think that's exciting. I mean, there's an opportunity space there as, in a way, cities are getting their mojo. The second big point I want to mention is how remarkably the pandemic has accelerated changes so quickly. Even if we produce a vaccine by the end of this year or into early next year, which would be a miracle, but I mean, there's a lot of good news out there suggesting that we may be on the right path. Some of these rapid transformations, they're going to be permanent. So in the short term, we're going to see big health moves in cities. There was a question already raised about mass transit and mobility. Well, we're already going to see mass testing in the context of transportation. Digital contact tracing systems, the retrofitting of buildings and public spaces for social distancing, the bolstering of health systems. I think in the long term, though, we're going to see the digitization. We are seeing the digitization of retail, the shift to remote working, the virtualization of health and education, the localization of food production in some cases, and this is a big one, the increased pedestrianization of cities. And that's exciting. It's not going to change every aspect of life. COVID-19 is not going to doom the city and give rise to dystopia, nor is it going to lead to a utopian, car-free, green city either. It's going to be somewhere, obviously, in between. And here's my third point. I'll end with this. Arguably, I think the most important shift or transformation that we're seeing right now is this move towards the digitalization of our governments, of our commerce, of our interactions. And this was already happening, but we've seen essentially 10 years worth of digital onboarding happening in less than 6 months. And all of you heard about how Facebook and Apple and Twitter and Microsoft have already moved huge numbers of their workers offsite. In some cases, they're claiming this will be permanent. But it's not just the tech firms. It's huge numbers of people are being moved, and people are talking about the death of the office. And this has big implications for cities, for downtown cores, for distressed assets that were already there, and by the way, for affordable housing in cities. So cities are rethinking density where they can. The idea of complete communities, this 15-minute city idea that Katarina alluded to, I think is real for those who are able to go there. They're trying to build in less compactness, less overcrowding, more breathing space. That's going to be a big issue. So I think multi-purpose moves, policy moves are going to be big towards more spacious, contactless urban spots. And the idea of the more complete neighborhood, I think, will come back in a way, an idea that's been around for a long time. But I don't think it's going to lead to the death of the downtown core by any means, but it will refocus the importance of the neighborhood. And this virtualization has big benefits. It may reduce dependence on international and domestic commuting, which has obviously knock-on effects for climate. It'll have knock-on effects on emissions in terms of congestion. Now, this won't happen on its own. It's going to need, obviously, government and business to provide a role in nudging and steering it. But I think it's a pretty exciting development. I'll stop there so that we can get right to questions.
Great, thanks. This has been a really provocative series of speakers, and I think what I'd like to do is we were going to give each of our speakers a few minutes at the end of the discussion period to kind of share some reflections. So keep typing in questions you've got for folks, but I'm inclined to open it up and see if any of the participants have reflections based on hearing this discussion. So please raise your hand if you'd like to get in the conversation and just to share try and keep comments really brief or observations, and then we'll work on compiling questions that are coming in for some final sharing by the speakers. And also, I'll just point you to, in kind of guiding reflections, there were 2 questions that we had included in the agenda about insights you take away from things that really resonated with you that you heard, or opportunities that you see amidst all this disruption and transformation underway to really strengthen urban resilience around climate change as well. So anybody like to get in to share some reflections? Please raise your hand.
And the hand raising is in the participant window in WebEx next to your name. If you look at your name, you can raise your hand there. Or you could also just unmute yourself if you're wishing to speak versus submit in the chat. I know we have some questions in the chat as well. So.
Yeah, and for a few of you who have chatted in, if you'd like to kind of share verbally your thoughts, I see a couple of folks, Neil Bird, Christine Werlin. Please don't be bashful. We've got a little while. It'd be great to hear from some folks.
So this is Christine. Do you want me to rephrase my question?
Sure, that would be great. Yeah.
Okay, hi. I can even turn on my video. So hi, this is Berlin speaking. I'm very happy to connect across the globe. This is a wonderful, stimulating input that we get from you. Thanks to the CIF team for organizing this. And I'm really happy that this is taking a broader scope and an opportunity to reflect on this shock. While Carlos was speaking, I was wondering, shocks, we don't like them, do we? So we were always wondering how we can do transformational change in a more incremental development. But now we have the shock, and the shock is global, and we're all shocked. And this is, in fact, an opportunity. So my questions, I mean, yes, the shock is first of all, it's very negative. It has a lot of challenges. We're all fearing basically for our lives. You guys in the US are fearing a little more than most of the other people. Sorry for that. But if we step back a step, we will need to think about how we can take this shock, as Carlos was putting it, and turn it into an opportunity. And I'm very happy to hear from Robert that there will be lasting changes, and you've sketched out a few. looking at those changes from the climate perspective, they're more or less neutral. They can go both ways. They can go into a less climate compatible world, or they could potentially, and that's my question, lead us into a more climate compatible world, a world from which we emerge, a shock from which we emerge with more resilience, with better systems, and with less energy consumption, with less emissions, with less potentially, at least for the Western world, also consumptive needs, where we're like falling back on staying at home is also nice, something like that. Yeah? So if you want to comment on how we can change this challenge into an opportunity, where do we need to put, which levels do we need to pull? Thanks.
Christine, any of the speakers want to reflect on that?
I think Carlos would have some great observations on this too, but just very quickly, it's the right question. And I think we do have, again, I mean, very conscious of the unbelievable, unbearable agonies that people are experiencing, and living in Brazil and having been in the US and now currently being in Canada during the whole crisis, I can see the gradations of challenges that people are facing. But I do think in speaking with mayors and with city councilors in particular, but also business, people sense that there is this window of opportunity, that it won't last long. So already, I was speaking with the city manager of Melbourne, for example, where they came out of the gate really quickly with a big plan and all sorts of strategies for rethinking zoning and opening up green space and pulling up pavement and putting down more, more pedestrianized areas and expanding their micromobility solutions and building more canopy. They're already a pretty green city, but even they were feeling the stress, the economic stress, and the political pressure to open up more quickly, to maybe loosen regulations around, let's call it less renewably friendly or climate friendly fuels, to expand, let's call it more regressive policies. So we do have this window. I understand and appreciate the hesitancy to talk about opportunity. And I think mayors sense this, but it won't last long. So the challenge here, I think, is how do you seize momentum of COVID-19 to make some big and smart policy moves without seeming to come across as being reckless, without overruling and overriding really meaningful environmental justice issues and concerns, and also with this looming economic crisis on the horizon, where cities we're already facing liabilities and huge deficits, but are now going to be just crushed with diminished revenue and the rest. So what's the answer? I think one is to help empower mayors and city councils to make those right decisions. So these city networks play a really important role in giving some political cover. I think these kinds of events are important because they also allow people to share ideas on what's working in different places. But the more mayors, city councils, which are often, of course, divided on these issues between the urban and the rural or the suburban, and and there's lots of stratification. I'm not suggesting for a minute city councils are on board with their mayors on these decisions, but to try to find the space to give them that opportunity. The second point I'd say is, and it's a point that Tim had already alluded to, is that there's already a big shift we're seeing in many countries, not all, from, if you can believe the surveys, that people don't want to go back to the old normal, as they're calling it. They're, as you say, people from, the examples are all well known, right? The anecdotes from the canals of Venice to the Himalayas that are clearing, to the cleaner skies over Beijing, which are now becoming polluted again, unfortunately, to other cities. People kind of, notwithstanding all the hardship, there was a lot of sense that people like some aspects of this, including the idea of getting out of the home when they could, and seeing some of these environmental moves. So let's harness that political capital and opportunity of citizens who've expressed desire for certain changes. And again, that will snap shut as the economic imperatives continue to grow as they will. So I think the third point is the economic case for smart decisions now needs to be made, and made really urgently. There are policy moves here that could result in some significant economic returns around issues of building and housing, mobility, and smarter investments that will save dollars. And that argument will win the day. So more than ever, I think we need to be mobilizing the data, the evidence, the analysis, the kind of stuff that some of our panelists are working on, and make it understandable, not just to the decision makers, but to the public, that investing now in a greener economy is going to deliver you further returns to the micro, macro scale later. The abstract discussion that this will make the world a better place may or may not resonate. It's got to be hyper-local.
Thanks, Robert. Just wanted to create some space. Carlos or Laura, any reflections you have on this conversation and question?
Yes. I think that being from a developing country, we have very different perspectives. I'm not sure that we can qualify it as optimistic or... Are you hearing me well, by the way?
Yeah, keep holding it close to your mouth. That would be great.
Okay. I'm not sure whether we're going to have all this opportunity taken advantage of here in Brazil, for instance. It's really wreaking havoc in our economy, which was already very steep for the past 4 or 5 years. And now I think that it's added to our situation. So I'm really not sure what is going to happen. But one thing I think we have as an advantage, the fact that our cities are built in not so planned way or in a sort of haphazard urbanization process, maybe we can value more our green spaces, which are not valued so much here in Brazil. I understand Robert lives in Rio, right? Rio has a very particular situation, but many other cities in Brazil have a lot of room to grow. And they could grow in a way that would value our green spaces, which are not really valued at all. So basically, I think that this is an opportunity that we might take here. But at the same time, I think that I'm seeing a lot of people who have repressed feelings about, going back to our old normal. And I don't think that there is going to be huge change. I think that people tend to fall back and they're longing for their old lifestyles. And I think leaders should actually be the ones who are going to help people value the changes or, the circumstances that were brought about by COVID, because there were important positive outcomes in the sense of, living differently. I think that there are many things that people realize that they don't usually realize living the lives we are living in our cities that are completely crazy. And I think that one very important change, even here, is technology, basically information technology, communications, and being more comfortable with using this kind of instrument. For example, I'm not very comfortable at all, as you probably have noticed, with using this. I'm more old school, and I like, being with people. So this is, for me, quite new. I tended to avoid this kind of event, and now I don't have a choice. So I'm not sure that everybody is going to take it up as an alternative. I am, for sure. So that is
Right.
my 2 cents here.
Thank you, Laura. Carlos, I wanted to create space if there's any reflections you have on this. And then in looking across the chat, I think one thing that I see emerging is, given this noted kind of acceleration of transformation and this, pressing, particularly in the urban context of people, local governments needing to respond very quickly to things, and then how do you keep that longer term game in sight, and how to balance that kind of accelerating decision making and response with some of the goals around and needs around inclusion and participatory engagement. And so I sense in some of the comments there that there may be some tension around that about how to move quickly, but how to be inclusive and really, address some of these broader equity and inclusion issues. So if you could speak to that as well I think that would be of interest to many.
Sure, I could add 3 points to that. So first, disaster scholarship, particularly disaster sociologists and disaster psychologists, bear witness to that point that in the immediate aftermath and in the midst of crises is when the general public sentiment is in favor of transformational change. So there is an opportunity, a window of opportunity that is associated with that. Why that doesn't exist for the longer term, part of it is because the crisis may have diminished or dissipated over time, but it's also because people don't see the benefits to their communities that comes from that window of opportunity. We talk about, my fellow panelists have talked about green spaces. Well, the reality is when green spaces are implemented, they're implemented in wealthy communities, typically in white communities in the United States, for example. So there's clear inequities that go on with those windows of opportunity and who benefits from them. Second point, the other challenge is that cities that don't have long major revenue streams, often secondary cities and smaller cities, are the ones that don't have the intellectual bandwidth, that don't have the capacity to be able to take advantage of these opportunities. They're not these Parises and Londons of the world. Absolutely no diss on London and Paris. I'm actually congratulating them for having the intellectual bandwidth. But other cities do not have that, do not have the resources to be able to take advantage and to plan and take advantage of the moment. Third point, let's not forget, cities are not city-states on the most part. We've talked over the last 20 years in the broader green, sustainability, and resilience movements about the power of cities, mainly because of the recalcitrance of national governments, particularly mine in the United States. But the reality is cities are not islands. They exist within a power structure and a line of authorities and hierarchies that include subnational and national governments. So the only way that a city can fully take advantage of this is through, quite frankly, politics. Power has to shift at the local level as well as the national level for them to be able to implement and fully take advantage of that wealth of that window of opportunity.
Right.
Tim, just really quick observation here, because I think it's a really interesting point. I mean, how do you act fast, think slow in a way, and how do you deal with the multiple and cascading challenges which are compounding each other? And I think the answer is with great difficulty, sensitivity, and agility. But I mean, to try to be more practical, what I've been struck by, and I'm talking here about, I live in Africa and Asia. That's where I spend and Latin America. It's where I spend most of my life. So I'm quite familiar with some of the challenges and the opportunity spaces in these sort of highly informal, and let's call it more resource-strained environments. But what I'm struck by across the board, whether it's like a Curitiba, which of course is one of the wealthiest cities in Brazil, or whether it's a Bogota, or whether it's a Bristol, or whether it's an Amsterdam, is that if you don't have a plan, and I don't want to overstate this point, but if you don't have a plan that allows for people to understand where you're going, it's very difficult to do any of this sort of systemic thinking. And that sounds so obvious, but what's striking is how often there isn't one. I'm working now with a mid-sized city outside of a very large city that has been really dynamic and impressive in its transformations up until COVID. And it hasn't been able to come up with a new plan for the moment. And that's hard. But I think if you don't have something that gives a vision that allows you to channel some of that micro-governance, which is so important to see change happen, that's able to coordinate the volunteerism, which, by the way, is huge and often untapped in many cities, in a way that's productive, that isn't able to deliver tangible outcomes based on the investments that cities are making. It's very difficult. What you end up getting caught in is a series of eddies or very specific verticals, and you're unable to see the big picture. And I think a really good example of this that I encourage people to look at is the city of Bristol, which has set up something called the One City Plan. And it was there before COVID, and it's based on the SDGs. And you can say what you will about the SDGs, big 17 goals, very complicated, lots of indicators. But as a means, as a planning tool, it's become incredibly powerful for the city then to say, look, we don't want to just meet the SDGs. We want to exceed them. So here's what we got, folks. Here's the plan. It's online. You can engage it. But this raises the second point, which is about inclusion.
Right, and I need to bring it to wrap up here pretty quick.
I'll close here quickly. Cities don't just need a plan on the sectors, they need a plan for digital strategy as well. I just want to say, this is the big shift, whether you like it or not. the technology is here, and there's big divides. 59% of the world right now is online, but in places like Seoul, it's 96%. In places like Somalia, well, no, Somalia is a bad example. Say Namibia, it's going to be, or Malawi, it's going to be a lot less. If you don't correct for broadband and you don't address the opportunity space to bring people on board, then you're missing a huge opportunity here. And I think the digital strategy is big for inclusion. It's big for climate. I'll stop there.
Great. Well, this has been a really provocative discussion. What I'd love to do is just create a space for 15 seconds for each of the three of you to share a few words of wisdom for this community that's focused on transformational change, or at least interested in transformational change. If you have, one brief thought of things that this group or people engaged in this space can do to help support really the opportunity space around this transformative moment. While you collect your thoughts to do that, I just want to reference that each of the speakers have shared a number of resources. Some were briefly up at the screen, and we'll be sharing those after. And then as soon as they wrap up, I want to create some quick space for Joe Dickman and Anna Williams to talk briefly about some upcoming webinars. But first, 15 seconds to each of you to share any kind of parting thoughts or words of wisdom for this group to think about its own work ahead. Anybody want to jump in first?
Sure, I'll start. Everybody just take good care of yourselves. And please look out for the least of your brothers and sisters and hold your leaders accountable.
Thanks, Carlos. Laura?
Yeah, can you hear me better now?
Yep, go.
Okay, because I switched from these to the computer audio.
Okay, yep.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, I cannot say enough how important it is to reduce consumption. And there will be winners and there will be losers. I mean, tourism industry, airlines, we are going to have to rethink our mobility patterns for sure, for the better and for the worse, depending on whose side you're in. This is my main point. Thank you very much again for having me here. It was a real pleasure. And the training too.
Robert?
I think I said more than enough, but just simply great to see this initiative. Wishing all of you guys the best of luck. Please take time out for yourself to find space to think about these issues. I'm encouraged by it all. And support your mayors in your cities to think big, and to think about those who are left behind and excluded, because this is, I think, the big challenge of our age.
Great. I wanted to turn it over to Anna and Joe to briefly share thoughts on next steps and upcoming webinars.
Thank you. And Joe, first to you about the next TCLP webinar, which will actually be the 8th of July, not June. Sorry about that. Well, go ahead, Joe.
Right. Thanks, Anna and Tim and Carlos, Robert, everyone who's shared today. I'd be remiss if I didn't just say first, this has been an amazing webinar. Sorry, let me turn on my video. Sorry. This has really been an amazing session and quite provocative and inspiring. Like many of us, I've had a heavy heart this week and last week, seeing what's going on here in the U.S. It's not right. But at the same time, and I really resonate with how Carlos framed this, as well as others, but your words especially were poignant for me, and the importance of standing in solidarity with all of us being affected by systemic racism. We're in the midst of a social, economic, health, and environmental crisis, and those are kind of the pillars of sustainable development. So, how do we navigate our way out of this? And my only inspiration and hope is around what all of you have said, that maybe there's a chance that we harness this momentum and the energy that's being displayed in a really positive way on the streets for a moment of transformational change. And, I guess that's the hope for all of us towards a greener and more inclusive and just future. more on the logistical side, but related topics. Next month, the TCLP, we're hosting a webinar. It's July 8th, and hope that many of you can attend, and we'll be sending out information on this, looking at the development impacts of climate finance. And so impacts or contributions around jobs, economic growth, energy security. We have some very preliminary results from some portfolio modeling in the climate investment funds on that topic. So we're looking forward to sharing some of that early findings, concepts, and plans for how we think about analyzing this topic going forward. And then also we'll be sharing some early work around what the CIF is doing on the topic of just transitions. So ensuring that no one is left behind and in the energy and other climate-related transitions, and seeing how especially CIF and MDBs and others can help support a just transition for workers and communities around the world. Again, some very early days, so we'll just be sharing concepts and early thoughts around those topics as well. So hope many of you can make it for that. Connected in some ways to this topic today. Thank you all for joining. Thanks again for the speakers and Anna, Tim, and everyone for organizing. It's been a great session.
And I want to echo the thanks. This has been amazing. It is connecting many of us around the world who can learn from each other in real time, and that is the spirit of this partnership. I think the profound level of transformation that's occurring in ways we can't even fully understand yet or predict is apparent to us all, from the most personal levels to the global levels, and those who are most vulnerable are probably the least identified and honored at this moment. So just keeping that in mind in terms of equity and the sort of silent suffering that we may not read about in all of the headlines. So thank you for just bringing your wisdom and your thoughts today. And I think with that, we can sign off, and we will follow up with some links to resources and make this available also to those who might want to share it or watch it later. Thank you all, and please do be safe and stay connected with each other. Thank you. I think we can officially adjourn unless there's anything else, but I want to thank everybody again for participating.
Thank you.
Especially the speakers.